Friends, hello. My name is Igor Havryshchak. This is the YouTube platform of Channel 24. Today is Monday, June 30th. I am pleased to welcome the opposition journalist Igor Yakovenko. Igor Alexandrovich, good afternoon. Hello. Igor Alexandrovich, I also want to talk to you about what is being said in the US because again Lindsey Graham, a Republican senator, who in the spring wrote a very strong bill that should actually kill Russia, that's sarcasm of course, says here's Trump about ready to put the squeeze on the Kremlin. But I will start with an atypical question about Azerbaijan, I mean for the beginning of our conversation, because it is very much carried there. I would like to remind our viewers that on June 27th, the FSB arrested 50 Azerbaijanis in Yekaterinburg. 2 dead brothers. They are accused of allegedly being responsible for a murder they committed in 2001. And that's where it all started. I know that now Maria Zakharova tells us that in Azerbaijan, special structures have entered the satellite. This is a news agency that belongs to the Russians, Russia Today. Russia Today. And they don't let diplomats in here. Igor Alexandrovich, no agreement has been reached yet, and Putin has not apologized for shooting down an Azerbaijani airline plane, and here is another scandal. The Atlantic writes that the axis of evil, Iran, China, and Russia, are very weak because no one from those two has helped Iran. And so they write that maybe Azerbaijan can take advantage of pushing in this region. You know, the fact that Azerbaijan in alliance with Turkey, Azerbaijan is not on its own, in alliance with Turkey now, is in a position to break relations with Russia, in fact, which is actually happening. This is a situation that can change radically everything in the Transcaucasus and the Caucasus. So Azerbaijan in alliance with Turkey is creating such a powerful oil and gas hub, which clearly opposes Russia as a power that can seriously influence the situation. In fact, Azerbaijan is now completely out of Russia's control, and this is apparently irreversible. And as for what happened, I don't think it was deliberate, that it was some move at the behest of the Kremlin. I mean the arrest of 50 Azerbaijanis, in which everything was done with such brutal methods that 2 were killed. I think that this was a local initiative, excesses of the executor, because it was the same when during the anti-Georgian campaign, when there was Georgian war in 2008, zealous executors on the ground started to poison Georgians and took this signal as a signal that it was necessary to oppress Georgians in some way. And it is the same, since we have bad relations with Azerbaijan, they decided to take advantage of it and show their sadistic tendencies. But the result, of course, exceeded all expectations. The relations with Azerbaijan are really spoiled. I don't think any of Putin's changes will help anything right now. I think that Aliyev took advantage of the moment and this crack between Russia and Azerbaijan. It is unlikely to be compensated in any way. Igor Alexandrovich, do you think that the fact that I was recalling the shooting down of the plane, that Putin was quicker to say that it was Ukraine's fault, because the drones were flying towards Chechnya, and accordingly the air defense worked and shot it down? Aliyev also keeps in his head that Russia has not apologized, has not made any steps. I just remember that at that time Putin himself initiated the call to Aliyev, and nothing was ever resolved. That's the first thing, that's where it all started. It really started with that downed airplane. The downed airplane was, of course, an accident. It was clearly not some kind of intent. But in this case, Russia, Putin behaved inadequately because, well, in cases like this, the obvious thing is you should have admitted fault, you should have apologized. But in this case, this imperial arrogance did not allow us to do the most obvious thing, to apologize, to admit guilt. Instead, he started putting on some nonsense about it being some kind of drones that were flying from the side of Ukraine and so on. In fact, it was just stupidity, because it was obviously an accident, which could have been in any case without any intent. It was enough just to apologize, but it was this imperial arrogance, which is very characteristic of Russia, that let it down. Great Russia will apologize to someone? As a result, we got a heavy and protracted conflict, which can hardly be compensated for in any way now. As much as I don't want this conflict between Azerbaijan and Russia to influence the war in Ukraine, it really can, right? Can we somehow combine that it weakens Russia in the Caucasus accordingly? Maybe there will be changes in the war between Russia and Ukraine, or is this a separate case and we don't need to combine them? You know, I don't think directly it's going to have any effect on the war. In general, certainly since it weakens Russia, it has some impact. But I don't think it will have any effect on the situation on the front. But in general, yes, any event that weakens Russia is good for Ukraine. I was thinking about Lindsey Graham. They're talking to the overseas about putting pressure on Russia. Graham, a Republican senator, said the following in an interview with Fox News. Allegedly, on Saturday, he played golf with Donald Trump. He even showed pictures on social media, and he said that for the first time Trump supposedly agreed that we need to pressure Russia and brought up this bill, and they say maybe they'll vote it out after July 6th. But there are variants of what they want to do next, to soften this bill so that Trump will decide whether or not to impose sanctions. And Graham allegedly says, these are not sanctions against Russia, but we're imposing sanctions against countries that buy energy from Russia. This whole thing with this bill, we've talked to you about it more than once. How much faith can we have, or what is the right way to put it, that the law will be voted on, and that it will really be some serious leverage against Russia's partners, or those who buy energy from Russia? The hope, of course, is that indeed Lindsey Graham, he really is. It's unlikely he just made up what happened. It's likely that Trump did tell him that it's okay to run this bill, but so far there's also a second piece of information, that there are still talks with Lindsey Graham and the other sponsors of this bill to somehow soften it, to take it out of there, to make some exceptions. From this bill, let's dot the I's. This bill is primarily aimed at India and China. That is, we are talking about the fact that Russia's main partners who trade with and buy oil and gas from Russia, well, first of all, oil and gas, they will be subject to a 500% tariff on trade with the United States.
Они будут облагаться 500% тарифом в отношении торговли с Соединенными Штатами Америки.
It's about China and India. But two questions immediately arise here. First, what exactly are the exceptions that Trump's representatives, so to speak, are pushing for from this law? How much will this law be neutered when it's finally signed into law? That's the first thing. And secondly, the tariff war that Trump waged against pretty much the whole world, including China, it didn't end well for Trump.
Практически всего мира, в том числе и против Китая, она, в общем, закончилась не очень успешно для Трампа.
So if this legislation is passed in this way, how it will affect the actual behavior of India and China is hard to say, because basically China has already reacted somehow to the high tariffs that Trump imposed, and Trump had to roll back.
Потому что, в общем-то, Китай уже как-то отреагировал на высокие тарифы, которые Трамп назначил, и Трамп вынужден был откатить назад.
So it's very hard to say how serious this is all going to be, first of all, taken as intended, and secondly, what the implications are. I mean, if you summarize all these reflections, I think that sanctions, of course, are a very good thing. They weaken Russia, but in the end, weapons are better, because the fate of this war will be decided on the battlefield, not as a result of some sanctions. So sanctions, of course, weaken Russia, but the most important factor is weapons. First of all, air defense. If Trump gave, for example, enough missile defense installations, it would probably be much more effective than even sanctions. Speaking of air defense, senators are talking about that as well. Kuhn said the following. He spoke to Vladimir Zelensky, Democrat senator. And that Zelensky's suggestion was exactly what was at the meeting with Trump at the NATO summit, that there is a military package that Ukraine wants to buy, which European countries are ready to allegedly finance. But we see that Trump is dragging his feet on this decision. Igor Alexandrovich, why? Is this how he wants to pressure Ukraine to make some concessions? Because, as always, he is trying to end the war quickly and pressuring the very weak. Or it's just geopolitics, he said at the NATO summit, that they need, and they supply Israel, and Ukraine is just strategically uninteresting to them. I think there's a third thing here. The thing is, after all, Trump is really counting on some kind of talks with Putin. Trump is still hoping to reach some kind of agreement with Putin. And to sell Ukraine the weapons that can really make a difference on the battlefield is to put some kind of barrier in the relationship with Putin. He said repeatedly already when it comes to supplying weapons to Ukraine, he said repeatedly that this could dash hopes of any negotiations with Putin. This painful passion to talk to Putin, to negotiate something with him, to make some deals with him, which it is unclear how they can be realized in the conditions of a country at war. That's what I think is the main problem with Trump and aid to Ukraine. Because to say that the air defense installations themselves are needed is, to me, not very convincing. No one is attacking the United States of America right now, so I think the argument is so-so. And the fact that this is a serious arms sale that could make a difference could really make negotiations with Russia much more difficult. This is the argument that is most important to Trump. Igor Alexandrovich, Bloomberg refers to the Kremlin website and says that Putin has signed a decree that several other areas are now classified as state secrets. These are international trade, economic policy, research and development, and mobilization and other areas. Analysts say the following, that the mobilization part is not a move to secretly conduct some kind of collection of resources for the war, but to supposedly classify the bunkers and escape routes of the government, because the Kremlin is very worried after the attacks and June 4th on strategic aviation, the 28th we know on Marinovka, I think this is how it's called, Volgograd region. They say that Putin is again classifying data because he is really afraid of future strikes from Ukraine's intelligence services. Putin is really very protective of his life, very afraid for his life. It shows up in everything, and it's his famous long tables that separate him from his interlocutors. And this bunker with its special conditions of entry, I mean, it really is. As for mobilization, I don't think any mobilization is going to happen in the foreseeable period, because for Putin at the moment, the problem of cannon fodder is largely solved in completely different ways. It's securing a supply of this cannon fodder using convicts, people from the colony. And ultimately, North Korean soldiers are fit for that role as well. So I think it's specifically about your own safety. Igor Alexandrovich, if we talk about sanctions from the European Union and what Trump rebukes them, can we agree with that? Because first of all, it was told by Czech President Petr Pavel that at a private dinner in the Netherlands at the NATO summit, they were trying to change Trump's mind about pressuring Russia. He didn't say he said no, he said he's not very decisive in that direction right now, but says that in turn Trump genuinely wondered, and why isn't Europe pushing Russia, raising 5% of GDP on defense, giving, only doing it by 2035? He used to say, you are asking the United States to impose sanctions, but you are buying energy from Russia. Do you think Europe's position, it's cynical, they're trying can't through Hungary, through Fico and Orban? Or it is very convenient for them to say and shout that we support Ukraine, we will give everything, but in reality they know that as long as Ukraine is bleeding, it is security for their countries. You know, I would put Orban's and Fico's position a little bit aside, because everything is very clear here. These are the two Trojan horses in the European Union and in NATO. Everything is quite obvious here. They are trying, well, especially Orban, they are trying at the same time, being in the European Union, to use all the advantages of this position, and in addition they are trying, so to speak, working for Putin, to use these advantages as well. That is, to sit on two chairs, shall we say. As for the European Union, first of all, these are very different countries. There are the Baltic states, which have indeed already given almost all their weapons to Ukraine, and are now trying to somehow secure themselves by building defensive structures. Roughly the same can be attributed to Finland. We can talk about the Czech Republic, which is this famous shell factory when all over the world they collected shells for Ukraine. It is hard to reproach here, but there is Spain, which does not see the danger and therefore refuses to increase its defense budget.
так сказать, свой оборонный бюджет.
There is the Federal
Есть
Republic of Germany,
европейские
which is now building
страны,
and
которые
practically
сейчас
in a short time will have its first production,
так сказать,
meaning a joint military
практически
plant
уже
producing long-range
строят
missiles for Ukraine.
первая продукция, имеется в виду совместный военный завод, выпускающий дальнобойные ракеты для Украины. То
I
есть,
mean, really, Europe
на
is
самом деле,
different. Europe really, for
Европа
quite a long time, at least for the last 30 years,
постепенно,
it was a continent
на
that felt
протяжении
safe under the
какого-то
American umbrella.
времени, ну, по крайней мере, последние 30 лет, это был континент, который чувствовал себя в безопасности так сказать, американским зонтиком.
After
После
this
того,
American
как
umbrella had
американский
blown,
зонтик
there was indeed a
выпустил,
situation of needing to rely on
так
one's
сказать,
own
возникла
strength.
ситуация необходимости опираться на собственные силы.
There is an
Понимание того,
understanding that we need to build our own European security system, but it is quite difficult to quickly get out of this comfort zone when, in general, the main resources go to the civil sector to meet the needs of voters.
основные, основные ресурсы идут на гражданский сектор, на удовлетворение потребностей избирателей. Довольно сложно.
The restructuring is underway. It is going slowly enough. It's hard to blame the Europeans for this because right now, right in a second, Europe is in no danger. In fact, really, here is some on the part of the Europeans' hope that while Ukraine with its blood, with its back closes, how cynical is that? Politics is a rather cynical business. So it's hardly a blanket rebuke of all Europeans in general. There are indeed countries that are well aware of the threat and that are trying to help Ukraine on the one hand, and on the other hand to build their own security system. In general, I think that Europe is ultimately Ukraine's main ally, and the creation of a European security system is something that Ukraine can organically become a part of and will definitely be a part of. In fact, Ukraine is perhaps the most important element of the European security system. Ukraine is clearly not going to join NATO. It is more or less obvious. But Ukraine will certainly not be a part of the European security system, but in fact is already a part of it. Because the Ukrainian army is today the only army in Europe that is capable of actually fighting the Russian army. So there is nowhere for the Europeans to go. They will of course count on Ukraine as a crucial element of the European security system. Igor Alexandrovich, please tell us, why do you think Putin flew to Minsk to communicate with Lukashenko? Can this be linked to the planned Allied exercises for this fall? And how much do the countries of the Baltic Sea and beyond need to fear some kind of hybrid action on the part of Russia? Even though Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, Finland, and now Ukraine have withdrawn from the Ottawa Convention banning anti-personnel mines. You know, I think that, of course, if you go by common sense, by some formal logic, Putin's attack on European countries, on NATO countries, would have to be considered a thing completely impossible. That is Putin, who is now throwing all his resources into the war with Ukraine. Of course, if we proceed from common sense, cannot attack any European country. But we realize how inadequate Putin is. And that is why there is such a possibility. That is to say that it is absolutely impossible, because from the point of view of common sense, the attack on Ukraine on February 24, 2022, was also absolutely irrational.
года было тоже абсолютно иррационально.
To attack the largest European country with 200,000 troops and in 9 directions, dispersing forces. It was the ultimate insanity, but Putin went for this utter madness and is now in its 4th year of wiping its army on Ukraine and effectively destroying its own country. Therefore, the degree of Putin's insanity is an indeterminate quantity, and so the possibility is there. And the Europeans understand that very well. They realize that they are dealing with a madman. Therefore, in principle, they are preparing for this war, although of course an attack on NATO countries, on Europe, which is dozens of times superior to Russia in economic power and in military power as well. This is the insanity. But we're dealing with just such a madman, so it's still a threat. Igor Alexandrovich, by the way, at the meeting with Lukashenko, he talked to journalists and spoke to some students. He, as far as I understand, a little bit in a joking way, but maybe also seriously recalled the frozen assets of Russia, in Europe and not only, about 300 billion, and most of these assets in Belgium. He said the following, that even if that money is taken away from us, it's robbery. As he said, it's good for the economy. Can we count on the fact that Putin has officially said goodbye to this money? I think there is no chance of getting that money back. How much does Putin realize that? I think he does realize it. I don't really understand the scenario by which Putin will be able to recover these assets, or rather the assets of the central bank. I think he understands. The fact that he can't say goodbye to it publicly is also obvious. He will never admit it. But I think there is an understanding of this, and ultimately still coming back once again to the visit to Minsk. I think it was important for Putin to once again control, to make sure that Lukashenko was in control, because Lukashenko's last meeting with Keith Kellogg showed that Lukashenko is still trying to create a space to play with the West. So his favorite thing, some kind of balancing act at one time between Russia and Europe. Then he tried to put China as a counterweight to Russia. And Keith Kellogg's latest visit showed that Lukashenko, even though he is actually in Putin's back pocket, is trying to win back some room for maneuver. Lukashenko is a much more experienced political player than Putin, and he's certainly coming from a variety of options. And eventually, in the event of some aggravation of the situation, Lukashenko will of course try to ditch Putin. That's why he met with Keith Kellogg. That's why he let some small portion of political prisoners go, counting on the fact that a distinction would be made between Putin and him when the situation escalated. So there could still be some surprises for Putin in the form of Lukashenko. I'd also like to bring up Trump's statement. He was in the Oval Office a few days ago talking to reporters, and he said, "I've heard about Putin's good remarks about me." He was interrogated. "What do you mean? Did you actually hear them?" He said, "Yes." Obviously, he was referring specifically to the statement that Putin said, "I plan to meet with Trump. Yes, I believe he sincerely wants to end this war." My understanding is that Putin is very good at manipulating Trump and just saying what the 47th president is happy to listen to. And in turn, why does Trump talk so flatteringly all the time? because he equals and genuinely respects dictators like Putin, Xi Jinping, Kim Jong-un, and wants to have the same power himself. Obviously, they are very close, so what Putin and Trump actually have in common is their commitment to the right of the strong. Putin and Trump are united by their desire to expand their country's territory in defiance of international law at the expense of other countries' territory. It is the famous Trumpian intention to make Canada the 51st state of the United States, annex Greenland, the Panama Canal, and so on. Finally, Putin and Trump share a fierce hatred of liberal democracies. So they are very similar in many ways. The other thing is that Putin is a fascist dictator in a country that he has actually successfully turned into a fascist Reich. I mean Russia. And Trump is a fascist dictator in a democracy, and a country that resists turning into a dictatorship in every way possible. So they have different situations. Of course, in a way, I guess Trump may even be jealous of Putin and other dictators who don't have those difficulties in leading their countries. Because in North Korea, in Russia, there are no such problems, no democracy, no opposition, no independent media. At the end of the day, there are no states that represent a high enough degree of autonomy. So, of course, in that sense, Putin is in a much more advantageous position than Trump. And Trump, of course, is in some ways jealous of the dictatorship that doesn't exist in the United States of America. And among other things, of course, flattery works here. Flattery as a recruiting tool, which Putin uses quite skillfully. Plus, since Trump is, after all, a man who is mostly about money, and Putin uses that well. And the constant talk of some deals that Trump might be interested in. And clearly, Trump's personal interest is constantly emphasized in these conversations. So Putin is still, despite the fact that he is a rather limited man, but he is certainly a master of recruitment. And in Trump's case, this recruitment through flattery and through the promise of material benefits, it works quite strongly. One last question about the Middle East. This history of freezing will continue. Is this a long stop to the confrontation? And I'm very interested. Do you think Netanyahu got what he wanted? Or is Netanyahu furious because he tried to overthrow Ayatollah Khamenei and Trump wouldn't let him? Indeed, the real threat of Iran acquiring nuclear weapons, it has been pushed back. How far pushed back? I think it would be irresponsible of me to give a deadline, but Iran's nuclear program has been pushed back quite seriously. Some say a few years, some say a few months, but I don't think anyone can confidently say at this point how much this program is set back. So in that sense, Netanyahu can be satisfied. And at least domestically, he has certainly strengthened his position. And I think his trials that were supposed to take place, they will be postponed as well, given the actual martial law. That's one side of the issue. On the other side, Trump, of course, he himself has said that he saved Ayatollah Ali Khamenei from certain death because Israel was intent on eliminating Iran's supreme ruler.
Израиль был намерен ликвидировать верховного правителя Ирана.
And
И
Trump has
Трамп, по
essentially
сути
tabooed
дела,
this assassination,
так сказать,
this
наложил
elimination.
табу на это убийство, на эту ликвидацию. И в
And in
этом
this
смысле
sense,
Трамп,
Trump
конечно,
has certainly
совершил
committed, it's hard
многие
to call it
регулярные
treason,
обстоятельства,
but to a
которые
certain
трудно
extent a
назвать
crime against the people,
в
first
известной
of all
степени
Iran itself, because he
преступлением
has
против
blocked the
народа
possibility of a really serious
своего
coup,
люда.
which could have
Собственно,
led to the elimination of Ayatollah
заблокировал
Khamenei.
возможности действительно серьезного переворота, к чему могла привести ликвидация Айталы Хамини. Вот.
What Netanyahu's
Какое
feelings are on the matter are rather difficult
какие
to
чувства по
say.
этому поводу испытывает Нетаньяху, сказать довольно сложно. Он
He has to,
вынужден
like every
заканчивать
other ally of the
длинные
United
свидетельные
States of
беседы у себя
America,
в Америке,
compliment Trump, talk
говорить о
about how it's
помощи
only
Трампу,
because of
говорить о
Trump
том, что
that this
только
victory happened at all.
благодаря Трампу вообще, так сказать, случилась эта победа. Но
That's what everyone
так
does.
делают все.
That's
Так
what the
делают
Europeans
европейцы,
do.
так делает,
That's what Putin does. That's what Netanyahu
так
does.
делает Нетаньяху.
In
Вот это
some ways, what's going on is reminiscent of political curling, where they each use their tongues to try to get Trump on their side.
языков, они каждый пытается Трампа перетянуть на свою сторону.
So
Но
far,
пока
in general, I'd
игрок,
say there's a draw going
я
on.
бы сказал, что происходит ничья.
Because on the one hand, Putin is succeeding by licking Trump, keeping him from serious sanctions from Trump going completely over to the side of Ukraine. So in that sense, it's a success for Putin.
Санкции от того, чтобы Трамп полностью, так сказать, перешел на сторону Украины. С другой стороны, так что это в этом смысле это успех Путина.
On the other hand, Netanyahu still managed to get some kind of involvement, however temporary, however fleeting, but Trump's involvement in the war against Iran. And finally, the Europeans, who made the NATO anniversary summit actually the summit of Trump's triumph, they managed to get Trump to be ready to continue with his participation in NATO, and in the end somehow still not that it is guaranteed, but there is still a pretty serious hope that Trump will sell, not for free, it is excluded, but to sell weapons to Ukraine for European money.
Не то чтобы гарантировать, но сохраняется довольно серьезная надежда, что Трамп будет все-таки продавать, не передавать бесплатно, это исключено, но продавать Украине оружие за европейские деньги.
So there's a clear draw in this political curling for now. For dragging Trump to his side so far, it's a tie. Thank you for the conversation. It's a tie, as you say. It's only 5 months into his reign. Another 3.5 years you have to put up with everything he says, the way he acts. Thank you for the conversation. Thanks for the invitation. Take care. Have a good day. Igor Yakovenko, an opposition journalist, was with us. Subscribe, comment, and share our conversation. My name is Igor Havryshchak. We will see you on the air of Channel 24.